Ready to dive into the world of criminal profiling? Today, we're dissecting the book Criminal Profiling: Principles and Practice. We're going to uncover what it is, how accurate it can be, and if it's more science or art.
It's a field that definitely captures the imagination. We'll be separating fact from fiction today and explore the real techniques behind those captivating crime show profiles.
Exactly. Let's start with the basics. What is criminal profiling and how's it used in investigations?
Basically, criminal profiling analyzes the behaviors displayed in a crime to predict characteristics of the offender. It's often used in cases of serial crimes, especially violent ones, where traditional investigative methods might hit a dead end. Imagine it like piecing together a puzzle, using behavioral clues to complete the picture of the unknown offender.
Okay, that makes sense. The book mentions a fascinating historical example, the Jack the Ripper case from 1888. They even brought in a doctor back then to try and profile him.
That's right. They brought in Dr. Thomas Bond, who analyzed the crime scenes and victims. He actually gave a description of what he believed the killer's physical appearance, occupation, and mental state might be. And you know what? It's surprisingly similar to the information sought in modern profiles.
So some things never change. Now, fast forward to the 1950s, Dr. James Brussel, a name some people might recognize from the Mad Bomber of New York case, was a huge influence on the FBI getting into profiling. What's the story there?
Brussel was a psychiatrist, known for creating profiles that actually led to catching criminals. In the Mad Bomber case, this guy had been planting bombs all over New York for 16 years. And just by analyzing the bomber's actions and letters, Brussel told the police that when they found him, he'd be wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned.
No way. Did that actually happen?
It did, he was. This case was a turning point. The accuracy of Brussel's profile, which extended to details about the bomber's background and motivations, really put profiling on the map, especially for the FBI.
That's incredible and a little spooky. It's like something straight out of a movie.
Yeah.
But here's the million-dollar question. How accurate is profiling? Is it really a reliable way to catch criminals?
That's the question everyone asks. And for a long time, the evidence was mostly anecdotal, those captivating stories that get passed around. But in recent decades, there's been a push for rigorous scientific study to determine how profiling holds up under scrutiny.
And that's where our deep dive gets really interesting, because we get to see how this stuff holds up to actual data. The book talks about a study that compared profilers to detectives, psychologists, and even college students at predicting offender characteristics. What did they find?
It turns out that experience in law enforcement, which many people assume is crucial for profiling, didn't make a significant difference in accuracy. The results were surprising.
So knowing the ins and outs of police work didn't necessarily make you a better profiler.
Not necessarily, no. Interestingly, factors like being able to understand complex information, think critically, and recognize patterns, these seem to matter more. These are skills that aren't exclusive to law enforcement.
That's fascinating. So it seems like you need a specific skill set to be a good profiler. It's not just about having street smarts or being a good detective.
Exactly. Profiling involves analyzing behavior, recognizing patterns to understand the motivation behind the crime. It's about understanding the why behind the who.
That makes sense. But how do you go from a crime scene to building a profile? The book mentions a statistical technique called multidimensional scaling, or MDS, which sounds really complicated. Can you break that down for us?
It can be complex, but at its core, MDS is about visualizing relationships. Imagine a big web. The closer 2 points are on the web, the stronger their relationship. In profiling, these points might be crime scene behaviors, things the offender did. MDS reveals patterns by analyzing those behaviors.
So, for example, with leaving a weapon behind versus taking a souvenir from the scene, those would be considered two different points on this web.
Exactly. MDS can show us whether those behaviors tend to cluster together, suggesting a link to a particular type of offender. It helps us see connections between actions and potential psychological profiles.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. The book uses an example with motor vehicles to illustrate this. Can we walk through that?
Sure. Let's say we're using MDS to analyze different types of vehicles. Our points might be things like tires, steering wheel, handlebars, carbon fiber chassis, steel chassis. MDS analyzes which features are present or absent in different vehicles and creates a visual map of how those features are related. We might find that tires and steering wheel are often clustered, while handlebars are further away.
So just by looking at the patterns of features, we see that motorcycles are their own thing, separate from cars.
Precisely. It's the same principle with crime scene behavior. MDS helps us see clusters of behaviors that might be linked to a certain type of offender.
So we can start to see these connections between actions and potential profiles emerge from the data. But we're not just interested in what happened, we want to understand why. That's where the psychology comes in, right?
Absolutely. And this is where the book dives into some fascinating territory. The psychology of serial crime.
So we're moving past just looking at a series of crimes, and now we're going to get into the psychological factors that can drive someone to commit them again and again. We're getting into the mind of a serial criminal.
Exactly. And the book really emphasizes that serial crime is, well, it's more than just multiple offenses. It's about this psychological propensity to reoffend.
So it's like something in their psychology is pushing them to continue these patterns.
Right. So we're talking about things like psychopathy, narcissism, sadism, even fantasies and compulsions.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Tell me more about these psychological components. What makes a serial criminal tick?
Well, it's rarely just one thing, right? It's often a really complex mix of factors, like psychopathy, for example. Psychopathy can make someone less sensitive to the suffering of others.
So they lack empathy.
Yeah, and less bound by social norms, too.
So they might not feel the same kind of guilt or remorse that most people would.
Exactly. Then you add in things like narcissism, which fuels the sense of superiority and need for control. And then there's sadism.
Sadism is about deriving pleasure from inflicting pain, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And in serial criminals, these tendencies can get all intertwined with fantasies and compulsions that drive their actions.
So it's almost like this kind of perfect storm of different psychological factors that come together. The book gets into specifics with different types of serial crime. It talks about serial rape and this research that identified 4 distinct behavioral patterns.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about those?
Yes, the 4 phases of serial rape, they are brutality, ritual, intercourse, and chaotic. Each pattern has these distinct characteristics, and it's in terms of the offender's motivations, how they choose their victims, how they act during the crime.
So walk me through these patterns. What sets them apart?
Okay, so let's start with brutality. With brutality, the focus is on inflicting pain control. The assault is characterized by excessive violence, often exceeding what's needed to subdue the victim.
So it's more than just like getting what they want. It's about something more.
It's about anger, rage, a desire for domination.
That's terrifying. What about ritual?
Ritual, well, the ritual pattern is marked by rituals. These offenders, they often have these specific scripts or fantasies that they act out during the assault. They might demand certain phrases from the victim,
Oh, wow.
use particular objects, or arrange the scene in a certain way, almost like they're setting a stage.
Almost like they're following a twisted playbook.
Exactly. And these rituals are often very deeply intertwined with their sexual gratification.
Wow. That's a disturbing thought. But I mean, it's important to understand these patterns to try to, get inside the mind of the offender.
It's true.
What about intercourse?
The intercourse pattern. Okay, so with that one, the primary goal is intercourse. And the violence that's used is often just enough to get that victim to comply. These offenders might try to minimize the assault in their minds. They might even try to convince themselves that the victim is willing.
That's disturbing in a whole different way.
It is, yeah.
And what about the last one? Chaotic.
Chaotic. Chaotic is the least predictable. These assaults are marked by disorganized, impulsive violence, often fueled by things like drugs or alcohol. The offenders often have a history of other criminal activity, and their motives can be a little bit harder to pinpoint.
So kind of a wild card in a deck of already terrifying cards.
Yes, exactly.
Now, the book also gets into a specific study on sexual murder that identified 4 new patterns. And it says that these patterns actually challenge some of the traditional profiling models. Can you tell me more about this study?
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. So for a long time, profiling in sexual murder cases really relied heavily on this idea of organized versus disorganized offenders. This study found that there's a lot more to it than that.
It's not black and white.
No, not at all.
So what are these new patterns and how do they differ from that old organized, disorganized model?
Okay, so the study identified 4 patterns again: predator, rape, perversion, and fury. Predator offenders, they're characterized by planning, control, and this focus on the hunt. They often choose victims who are strangers, and their crimes are very methodically carried out.
That does sound a lot like the classic organized offender.
It does share some similarities, yeah, but there are nuances. Predator offenders might engage in more elaborate fantasies. They might take souvenirs from the crime scene, And their crimes often reflect this very deep-seated need for power, control, even like a sense of entitlement.
Like they're the powerful ones and they can take what they want.
Exactly.
What about the rape pattern?
Rape. In this pattern, the primary motive is sexual assault. The murder itself is often impulsive, occurring during or after the rape has taken place. The offender may not have initially planned to kill the victim at all, but the violence escalates and spirals out of control.
A situation where things take a very dark turn.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It highlights the fact that not all sexual murders are premeditated or part of some, long-standing fantasy.
Right, because sometimes it might not even be the initial intention, but then it happens.
Right.
Okay, what about perversion? What makes that pattern unique?
Okay, so perversion offenders are driven by extreme and often what are considered deviant sexual fantasies. Their crimes are characterized by bizarre rituals, unusual objects or acts, and this fascination with inflicting pain and humiliation. They're often very meticulous about planning their crimes, and they derive sexual gratification from the act itself, not just the lead up or the fantasy.
And how is that different from predator?
Okay, so predator offenders are often more focused on the hunt, the control, the domination, where perversion offenders are driven by those very specific, often very dark sexual fantasies. The murder itself becomes part of their ritual.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered predator, rape, perversion. What about fury?
Okay, fury offenders. They're characterized by explosive, uncontrolled rage. The murders are often very violent, very chaotic, with little evidence of planning. Their victims might be chosen randomly, and the offender might not even remember the details of the crime afterward.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like this blind rage taking over.
That's a really good way to put it, yeah. And this pattern, like chaotic in the serial rape typology, really challenges the idea that all serial killers are these calculating masterminds. Sometimes it's just about pure, unadulterated rage.
So we're really seeing a spectrum of behavior here, from these meticulous planners to these, impulsive actors.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. This is all fascinating, but I'm also wondering, how does this research actually get used in real-world investigations? How do these patterns help, catch criminals?
Well, these patterns can help investigators understand the motivations, the methods of these different types of offenders. And they can also point to specific characteristics that might help narrow down a suspect pool. It's all about recognizing those patterns and using them to understand the individual behind the crime.
Right. So if you see certain behaviors at a crime scene, you can start asking, does this look like the work of a predator or a perversion offender or something else? It's about fitting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Exactly. And that can help direct the investigation. For example, if investigators are dealing with a ritual offender, they might focus on finding someone with a history of similar behavior patterns, someone who might have expressed these fantasies before. It's about using that profile to guide the investigation, not to dictate it.
Right. So it's not just about a checklist of traits, but it's about a deeper understanding of the psychology that's at play.
Yeah.
It's about getting inside their heads.
Exactly.
It's amazing how much goes into understanding these crimes, from psychology to these patterns to, like we're talking about, geography.
It's true. It's a field where so many different disciplines sort of converge and they have to work together. But, it's important to remember that profiling it's a developing field. It's not a perfect science by any means.
Right. It's not like we have all the answers.
Exactly.
So with all this talk about profiling, I have to ask, how do profilers make sure they're not leading investigators down the wrong path? Because it seems like there's a lot of room for interpretation.
You're absolutely right. That's a really crucial point. And the book actually has a whole section outlining the steps of constructing a written profile. And they really stress the importance of objectivity, transparency, and scientific rigor. It's not something you go into lightly.
So no wild guesses or hunches based on gut feelings.
Not if you're doing it right, no. A good profiler is constantly evaluating the evidence, questioning their assumptions, and staying open to alternative explanations. They're not trying to fit the crime into a neat little box, They're letting the evidence guide them.
It's about being detectives first and profilers second.
Exactly. And being able to clearly articulate their reasoning. Because investigators need to understand how you arrived at your conclusions.
It's about, presenting that information in a way that's clear, concise. It doesn't, overstate what you think you know. So it's like guidance, not this is the be-all, end-all, this is the answer.
Exactly. Remember, a profile is meant to be a tool, not a definitive answer.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, before we wrap up, there was one thing that struck me. The book really focuses on serial crimes, but what about single, isolated crimes? Can profiling be used in those cases too? Or is there just not enough to go on?
That's a really great question. Because, yeah, serial crimes, by their very nature, they offer more data points. There are more patterns to analyze. So with a single crime, it can be much harder to pick out those behavioral fingerprints. It's like trying to understand a whole song from just hearing a couple of notes.
Right, right. You don't have the full picture.
I guess
So
so.
the less data you have, the more challenging it becomes to create a reliable profile.
That's generally true. But even in single crime investigations, profiling can still offer some valuable insights. For example, it might help investigators understand the motivations behind the crime, or the level of planning that was involved, or even potential risk factors for future offenses. So it's about taking what information you do have and trying to build a better understanding of the situation.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all tool, but something that can be adapted to different situations.
Exactly. And I think the key is to always use it responsibly and with, a healthy dose of skepticism. Profiling is a powerful tool, but it's not a substitute for thorough investigation and critical thinking.
Skepticism and a whole lot of critical thinking. Well, on that note, I think we've successfully unpacked the world of criminal profiling. From its history to how it's used today, it's been really interesting to kind of go on this journey into the minds of criminals and the techniques used to understand them.
Yeah. From its intriguing history to its sometimes controversial applications, it's a field that continues to evolve. It definitely makes you think twice about the crimes we see in the headlines.
It really does, because it leaves you wondering, how much can you really tell from a fingerprint? Or a carefully staged crime scene? Or even a chillingly detailed threat? It makes you wonder, is it an exact science? Or are we just scratching the surface of what criminal profiling can really tell us?